The total escalation of wide-scale conflict within the Eastern world continues to grow, and with it, we see that people within the Western world, like that of the United States, are now officially jumping into the fray, with reports of United States airstriking Iranian-backed facilities within Syria. It's happening again, and once again, it is important that the people who understand the nature of how evil and despotic war is to speak out and do so with their feet planted in the ground, understanding the place with which you stand, because there's nothing more important than speaking out against the slaughter of innocent men, women, and children, especially in a day and age where you have free access to information and the ability to have wide scale reach, given you reach the right circumstances. There is no reason to not speak up against the nature of the heinous actions of the superstructures of global governments and all of the tyranny that is being pushed when they are consistently ginning up the factors of war, only pushing the escalatory process higher, making it possible that you, your loved ones, will have to go abroad to go fight in these conflicts, to go die for the world empire, and this is a standard that I simply will not be quiet about. Let's go ahead and jump into this and why it's so important to always be anti-war. From the Associated Press, U.S. fighter jet strikes Iranian-linked sites in Syria in retaliation for attacks on U.S. troops. And the first thing that comes to mind when I read this headline, and I wonder if it's the first thing that comes to anyone's mind outside of someone who just sits there and thinks about the nature of the U.S. and our foreign policy as the metrics of being nothing more than the world police, is this something that you think about? What sphere of influence is this? What sphere of influence were our soldiers in when they were attacked? Were they attacked in Iran's sphere of influence, or were they attacked in ours? That is something to think about. And as we can see here from CNN Business, or CNN Politics, I should say, another article that it reads just like the last one, and we're going to go ahead and jump into this one here. It says, U.S. strikes 2 facilities linked to Iran-backed militias in Syria, following series of attacks on U.S. forces in the Middle East. And like I said, where in the Middle East? Whose sphere of influence are we in if we're actually out in the Middle East? If you are not aware of the borders of Iraq and Afghanistan, well, they line Iran because Iran is centered directly in between them. And one thing we have to understand is the nature of where our military bases were placed within Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was littering them all across the border of Iran. If that is not a threat, I do not know what is. What we see here, the U.S. carried out airstrikes targeting 2 facilities linked to Iranian-backed militias in eastern Syria on Thursday, according to a statement from Defense Secretary Lord Austin, following a series of drone and rocket attacks against U.S. forces in the region. The U.S. assessed that airstrikes against the facilities linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups did not result in any casualties, according to a Friday statement from Brigadier General Pat Ryder, the Pentagon press secretary. The strikes carried out by an F-15 fighter jet and a pair of F-16 fighter jets using precision-guided munitions targeted a weapons and ammunition storage facility in Amu Kamal near the border between Syria and Iraq. The strikes destroyed the facilities, according to Ryder. So one thing I want to cover with this immediately is what they're talking about when they say precision-guided munitions. When they talk about a precision strike, it puts something in the mind of so many people, even those who are inoculated against war propaganda, that when they say precision, you're thinking that it hits exactly what it needs to, it doesn't cause any surrounding damage to anything else or anyone else, and with it, it was precise. Except an explosion is anything but precise, because it's not a controlled action. And the thing that we see is this is what happens after we have these precise missile strikes. Well, there's a chaotic reaction, which is an explosion, which is a totally uncontrolled thing. And this is something that we need to get into the mindset of so many people, is just these little idioms that the government uses when they talk about their actions abroad. Well, it was a precision strike. You really don't have to worry about it. No, this isn't a problem. We're only putting sanctions. It's like, sanctions are a war crime, but no one ever actually thinks about that because people aren't familiar with the nature of international law and also wartime law. So one thing I actually had come to mind when I was reading this was a clip from the good old General Wesley Clark, and he's talking about how the U.S. was going to overthrow 7 countries in 5 years after he received information from a memo that was going around in Washington. And with that, we see that the U.S. failed on their time frame, but they've finally been able to goose-step themselves into the frame of pushing war with Iran, as we see the propaganda from the military-industrial complex and also the Republican and Democratic establishment talking about the nature of the threat of Islamic extremism and how Iran must be quelled, and the nature of how all of the people within this fundamentalist ideology must be stopped. And with that, you were talking about the stopping and killing of millions, if not billions of people, but the people within the world empire do not care as long as it means that they can push their standards. Let's go ahead and jump into that clip from General Wesley Clark, Because when you hear Syria, when you hear Iran, when you hear Iraq, when you hear Afghanistan, and all of these things, if you've seen this clip, it almost always should come to mind, because you have to realize this was always the plan. They just fucked up on the time frame.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
As you can see, 7 countries in 5 years. They had their standard, they dropped the ball in their time frame, but nonetheless, they're finally going ahead and step their way towards Iran. And with it, what do we see? We see people like Thomas Massie stepping up and saying, no, this is not okay. This can spread and lead to a further conflict if we continue to get involved with what is going on with Israel and Palestine, due to the nature of how much this is a truly explosive conflict within the Middle East. Because this is not just a war over territory, but this is a holy war. And with it, Thomas Massie says, "I condemn the barbaric attack on Israel, and I affirm Israel's right to defend itself. However, I will not be voting on House Resolution 771 today because, 1, it calls for sanctions on a sovereign country. Sanctions are a prelude to war and hurts the citizens of the country more than the government of the country that's being sanctioned. Also, sanctions as well as blockades being nothing more than collective punishment, which is a war crime under the eyes of international law. Ultimately, sanctions create laws that will be used to prosecute American citizens who engage in trade, not citizens of the sanctioned country. In short, sanctions do not achieve the stated purpose, but do breed resentment of our country abroad. 2, it asserts the necessity of foreign aid commitments, which I have voted against. Our country is going bankrupt, and we can't afford to borrow money and lend it overseas, yet this resolution states that we should. 3, it contains an open-ended promise of military support that is so broad that it could be interpreted to commit U.S. soldiers to the conflict. U.S. troops should not be engaged in this conflict. 4, it tends to broaden the conflict to other countries when it would be better to keep the war contained geographically. Here's a link to the text resolution, which contains some statements. I do support some statements, and I cannot support others. So if you would like to go check out the resolution, you can go ahead to the link in the description down below. Everything I use for my videos will always be in the description, so you can go ahead and get the assets and the resources and go ahead and go through them yourself. Thomas Massie, once again applying the nuance that needs to be stated when it comes to the nature of this conflict, understanding that putting our military aid into this, as well as pushing so many of our naval vessels abroad, as we are currently doing, is something that is only going to make this worse. So one thing I want to jump into is this clip right here from the IDF. An urgent message for residents of Gaza. Well, this person put it best, and I'm not sure who this is, but he says, a video in English for Arabic speakers that currently have no internet or any form of communication is not a warning. It's literally PR for the Western world to try and justify what you're about to do. That's absolutely true. Because the people within Gaza already do not have internet, they do not have power, and with it, they would have no ability to receive this message. I'm going to go ahead and jump into this clip from the IDF, and let's see what they have to say.
Attention, citizens of Gaza, listen carefully. This is an urgent military advisory from the Israel Defense Forces. For your immediate safety, we urge all residents of northern Gaza and Gaza City to temporarily relocate south. Let me repeat. We urge all residents of northern Gaza and Gaza City to relocate south immediately. This is a temporary measure. Moving back to northern Gaza will be possible once the intense hostilities end. Hamas puts your life in danger by placing weapons and forces within civilians' area in Gaza, including schools, mosques, and hospitals. The impending IDF operation is set to neutralize these threats of Hamas with precision and intensity. Humanity remains haunted by the massacre unleashed by Hamas on October 7th, a massacre of innocent lives. Israeli men, women, children, and babies were beheaded, executed, raped, and burnt alive. We won't forget that. And the kidnapping of over 200 Israelis, we will not forget. To the residents of northern Gaza and Gaza City, your window to act is closing. Move south. For your own safety, move south. This is not a mere precaution. It is an urgent plea for the safety of the civilians in Gaza.
An urgent message for the residents of Gaza. So what is that message? One that they will not be able to hear because they do not have internet to receive this message. The only way they could get it was dropping pamphlets over the city, which is exactly what we did over Baghdad before the shock and awe campaign, which if you are not familiar with the shock and awe campaign, go ahead and look up the clips of what happened and how horrific it was. Go look up the casualty count of what happened after shock and awe. Now, what we see here is step 1, put out the message. Step 2, put it in a language they can't understand. Step 3, make sure they have no way to actually receive it because they have no internet. Step 4, realize this is actually just propaganda pushed out to the Western world so that the West will be pushed into a state of pacification when it comes to the nature of the war crimes that are about to be committed against the Palestinian civilians by the IDF. Alrighty, moving on, we see from John Kirby, here we see the White House says, this is war, it is combat, it is bloody, it is ugly, and it's going to be messy, and innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. Do you actually think these people care whatsoever that innocent people are going to be hurt and dying going forward? No, of course not, because they've been signing off on wars that do this for the past 70 years.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly, and it's going to be messy. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different. I wish that that wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen. And that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it dismissible. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to still express concerns about that and do everything we can to help the Israelis do everything they can to minimize it. But that's unfortunately the nature of conflict.
That's the nature of conflict, and he's absolutely correct about that. It is the nature of conflict. Innocent people being maimed and destroyed through absolute barbarism. And what do we see? We see that people like this, John Kirby, which when this conflict originally started happening, I watched this man walk out to the podium and fake cry, acting like he was so torn asunder by the nature of all the awful things he had seen. If he's been doing this job as long as he has, he's seen things worse than what we're talking about happening in this conflict. And I'm not downplaying all the awful, heinous, atrocious things that have been happening both to Israeli citizens and Palestinian citizens. It's awful on all sides. War crimes are being committed by both sides, and it's absolutely horrific. There is no excuse. And what we see here, we have anarcho-Christian explaining why I'm anti-war. He says, this is why I'm anti-war. But it applies perfectly for me just as well. It is simply the nature of propagandizing young men into the mindset of being willing to kill someone who very well could have been their friend. What we see is, in the World War, we used propaganda to make the boys accept conscription. They were made to feel ashamed if they didn't join the army. So vicious was the war propaganda that even God was brought into it. With few exceptions of our clergymen joined in the clamor to kill, 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 to kill the Germans. God is on our side, and it is his will that Germans will be killed. And in Germany, the good pastors called upon the Germans to kill the Allies, to please this exact same God. And this is the problem, because this is all war is propagandizing young people into a state of violence where they are willing to leave rationality behind because they have seen so much chaos and let's say had so much chaos instilled within their soul because they've been propagandized to such a point where it's all they know. And with it, they harbor nothing but hatred in their heart for their opposition and they go and commit these heinous acts of violence. And what do you think bombing places like Palestine is going to do? It's only going to give further fuel for the fire for further Islamic extremism in the region against the Jewish people within Israel, and that's wrong. And this is something that Israel needs to understand, that if they were to wipe Palestine off of the map, what you are doing is activating the entirety of the Muslim world against you, and then you are asking for the entirety of the West to step in and defend you. And with that, what does that mean? That means they're asking for you, your family members, and your loved ones to go and fight and die for Israel, because they will actively fight the Muslim world, and they will expect you to fund it with your tax dollars and with the lives of your loved ones. What do we see here? We see this is from Claire Daly, and she is an MEP from Ireland. She says, "I'm appalled by the silence regarding the crimes committed in Israel and in Gaza. Many with me demand a ceasefire and the provision of immediate humanitarian aid, water and food and medicine to Gaza now." She says, hashtag politicians for peace, which there are so few, Thomas Massey being one of the great ones here within the United States, and I felt it important to highlight another fantastic one in Ireland. She says, a historic crime is unfolding in Gaza and the EU is in it up to its neck. MEPs sit and watch the slaughter and can't even condemn it, calling it a humanitarian crisis as if it was caused by the weather. Infamy. The EU will never live the shame of today's resolution down. Let's go ahead and jump into this clip from Claire.
Dankeschön, President. I voted against this motion after a week of horror in Gaza and the EU diving in head first, draping our parliament in the Israeli flag, aiding and abetting in war crimes, including the bombing of a hospital, and still we find it impossible to say that Palestinian lives matter. We're still privileging one category of victims over another. We talk about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but why is there a humanitarian crisis? Is it a national disaster? Who cut off the water, fuel and electricity? Are we not sure? Who is bombing Palestinian civilians? Do we not know? Do you think we could mention it? There is a crime unfolding in Gaza now, such as we have not seen since the 1940s, and we are in it up to our necks. We're watching Israel murder Palestinian civilians and preparing to drive millions of them into the Sinai desert to annex and colonise their land. It's another Nakba. It's a crime against humanity, not a humanitarian crisis. The EU will never live down this shame. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza.
That is what it means to be truly anti-war. To say the uncomfortable thing when it counts, when it matters. To dig your feet in the sand, to say this is the line I will not cross. And with it, I will stand for the people who are being trodden on and oppressed, no matter what you tell me, no matter how many moral sticks you attempt to beat me with, no matter how much propaganda you sling at me, you will not counter my understanding of what is right and what is just. And here, let's go ahead and jump into Kanoka the Great. He says, the Pentagon is deploying 2 carrier groups, Elvin Burke-class destroyers, a number of Ticonderoga-class cruisers, amphibious assault ships, THAAD and Patriot missile defense systems, multiple squadrons of fighter jets, strategic bombers, and undisclosed assets to the Middle East. The Pentagon expects Iranian proxies to continue to target U.S. troops in the region and has already stated that they will respond decisively. What's the probability that this escalates into a war between the United States and Iran? Now let's go ahead and draw ourselves mentally back to that clip of General Wesley Clark. The Pentagon said between October 17th and the 24th, the U.S. and coalition forces have been attacked at least 10 separate times in Iraq and 3 separate times in Syria via a mix of one-way attack drones and rockets. We know that the groups conducting these attacks are supported by the IRGC and the Iranian regime. We are seeing the prospect for more significant escalation against U.S. forces and personnel across the region in the near term, according to Iranian proxy forces and ultimately from Iran. So by virtue of our announcement over the weekend, we are preparing for the escalation both in terms of defending our forces and responding decisively. We will get into that clip in just a moment. One thing I want to cover is this, and this is the tracking U.S. naval assets that are being sent to Israel or just surrounding Israel. And here we can see the Ike carrier class, the Batons, we can see the Ford carrier class ships, we can see all of the other ships that are around here, and it shows you the process of where they would be placed. And I have some friends that are in the Navy that are, let's say, decently high up in the Navy that have given me some, let's say, interesting information about the pathing of which way submarines take. And we're not even showing the submarines that are going there. This is just the open air ships that can be seen via satellite. So The one thing that we have to understand is, if this is all we see, I promise you there is absolutely more. Shout out to my friends in the Navy. I went to school with these kids, and I was like best friends with them growing up, so like I'm not going to be disclosing names, but nonetheless, much love to you guys. So here we see from Michael Tracy, it says, just back from Israel, Senator Chris Coons says a call for striking Iran is necessary. And what we see from John Thune, we can't afford to not to act. So they're saying we can't afford not to strike Iran, basically, and going with the Lindsey Graham standard of what we actually need to do and how we have to solve this crisis. Now let's go ahead and jump back to that video that Kanoka had posted and talk about the fact of what's being sent around to Israel and the process of, well, everything that's going to be happening with the possibility of escalation with Iran. And as we saw from that video with General Wesley Clark, it appears that this may be what the United States and the world empire wanted all along.
Between October 17th and the 24th, U.S. and coalition forces have been attacked at least 10 separate times in Iraq and 3 separate times in Syria via a mix of one-way attack drones and rockets. So again, those are the initial numbers. We're continuing to work to CENTCOM to ensure we get you the facts on these.
These at least 13 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, do you believe that Iran is responsible for these? Were these all conducted by Iranian-backed proxies?
Well, you know, I think we've been pretty clear on this, and my colleagues at the White House yesterday talked about this as well. We know that the groups conducting these attacks are supported by the IRGC and the Iranian regime. What we are seeing is the prospect for more significant escalation against U.S. forces and personnel across the region in the very near term, coming from Iranian proxy forces and ultimately from Iran. So by virtue of our announcement over the weekend, we are preparing for this escalation both in terms of defending our forces and responding decisively. And I just want to emphasize the point that I made earlier, which is that we always reserve the right to defend ourselves, and we will never hesitate to take action when needed to protect our forces and our interests overseas. So to be clear, we have significant capabilities in the theater right now, right? I mean, you've got the Ford that's in the Eastern Mediterranean. You've got an expanded number of fighter aircraft throughout the region, in addition to the naval assets that are already in the Central Command AOR. So there should be no confusion whether or not, you know, we have the ability to respond to any potential threats right now. The announcement over the weekend, as it highlighted, is intended to enhance those capabilities and sustain those capabilities for as long as we may need in order to continue to both deter and protect our troops. Since that Hamas terrorist attack, we've also been crystal clear that we do not want to see the situation in Israel widen into a broader regional conflict. And as you've heard President Biden, Secretary Austin, and other senior U.S. leaders say, our message to any country or group thinking about trying to take advantage of this situation to widen the conflict is don't. We've already deployed a significant number of additional U.S. military capabilities into the region to bolster our regional deterrence efforts, strengthen our capabilities there, and enhance our ability to respond to a range of contingencies. In addition to the capabilities that we've already announced, I can also confirm that the New Jersey Air National Guard's 119th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron arrived within U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility today, with additional F-16 Fighting Falcon Squadron bolstering U.S. posture to deter further aggression in the region. And again, it is our aim to avoid any regional expansion of Israel's conflict with Hamas, but we stand ready and prepared to protect and defend our partners and our interests, and will act to do so. Finally, in terms of force protection, the message is simple. As Secretary Austin has consistently made clear, we will take all necessary measures to defend our troops and our interests overseas.
I don't think I've ever seen us send this much hardware into a region as a bluff. And as Scott Adams said, odds of war with Iran are 100%. We don't bluff this expensively. And that's absolutely true. If you think this is all of the hardware or assets and personnel that's in the region, well, that's quite gullible of you. Here's the thing that we need to understand. With it, this means we are sending soldiers and resources to the region, and if any of our soldiers are injured or killed, that is the catalyst that the U.S. empire will use to start an entry into this conflict. And with it, it's going to be incredibly dangerous because it's only going to make this more explosive. And the thing that makes this incredibly explosive is this clip from Mike Cernovich that explains perfectly what's going on with U.S. foreign policy. This is from Lee Fang. He says, if you want to understand American foreign policy, this is the single most important video you can watch. And that's absolutely true. Let's go ahead and jump into this clip. I had to re-record this segment because my file ended up corrupting right here. So nonetheless, let's go ahead and jump in.
We're talking to members of Congress about Israel and the U.S.'s relationship.
All right, y'all go. The U.S. has an intrinsic interest in making sure that Israel not only receives our best prayers and offers of success, but our armaments, our money, and our ability to make sure that in a very dangerous reason this democracy survives.
There are some biblical prophecies that say that control of Jerusalem by the Jews is important for the second coming of Christ.
This entire matter is based upon faith of our Maker, of our Creator, but it's also faith of a chosen people.
Can you ask why the Democrats keep using our law enforcement officers as political pawns? The Democrats who have been campaigning to defund our law enforcement as their people, BLM and Antifa, riot and loot in the streets. How would you like to see the Capitol Police
There's a
on
new
there?
government in Israel. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the U.S. relationship with Israel?
There have been two nations created to glorify God, Israel and the United States of America. I will bless both, I will honor both, I will do all I can to stand and defend them.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Take care. Garen, do you have a quick second?
Sure, man.
Do you think there's a role of religious extremism here in the U.S. funding and shaping the conflict? I mean, there are a lot of folks who are part of the evangelical movement that want
Support Israel.
Support
Yeah,
Israel,
yeah,
and
yeah.
we don't really kind of see that same kind of constituent group pushing the other way.
Yeah, I wouldn't label the Baptist or the evangelical community as extreme because I feel like they're following the Scripture and what the Scripture says about Israel. Those who bless Israel will be blessed. I mean, they take it literal, and I'm one of those people.
You know, there's some Christian Zionists that do believe in some of these biblical prophecies, and they're very controversial even within the Christian Zionist evangelical community. Yeah, and believing in Armageddon, that there will be a final battle around Jerusalem, and that after that battle, you know, there's a judgment day, Jews will be killed or converted, Jesus will come back, there's going to be a rapture event. What do you think about those kind of prophecies?
I believe Jesus will come back, and I'm going to be on his side.
And here you have it. That is the single most important piece of information when it comes to the nature of understanding American foreign policy with the Middle East and defending Israel. If you are not aware of this, now you know, and if you are not okay with it, well, now you know this is the nature of what your tax dollars are being spent on and why Israel is consistently referred to as our greatest ally. It is because the nature of the evangelical Zionist right has become so fervent and they have so much power within the foreign policy establishment and are trying to push the ideals of prophecy. And with it, they do not care how many individuals they sacrifice at the altar. And here's the thing that I want to cover. I just mentioned the ideal of sacrificing people at an altar. What we've had throughout all of human history, throughout every human society, we've had human sacrifice. You can go back and look. There hasn't been a single society that's existed without human sacrifice in some way, shape, or form. And I wonder if this is just the nature of ours. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Thumbs up if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Subscribe if you like this kind of content. Do not fall for the nature of the war propaganda that is consistently being pushed out by the war machine, because the nature of understanding that we have to avoid conflict and fight for peace at all ends is the most valuable thing that you can know when it comes to the prospect of dealing with war. Because the people who advocate for it the loudest are always those who will never be on the front lines fighting it themselves. And with it, those people are institutional criminals, and you need to realize that they would gladly sacrifice you and everyone you know and love solely for the fact of moving that nation-state border just a few inches to push their metrics of their evangelical perspective. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Stay lovely, stay great. Peace out.